harnessing our intensity or managing our intensity is not for other people. It's for yourself so that you can use it and not let it get in the way. I think about Brene Brown and her talking about fitting in versus belonging. If we're trying too hard to tone down our innate self, then we may fit in, but we're not going to truly belong until we can be our full selves.
Welcome to yourbrilliance.com. I'm your host, Amy Waterman. Have you ever been told that you're too much? You get wildly enthusiastic instead of playing it cool. You feel too deeply, you worry too much, and you obsess over things that you should let go. Sometimes it can feel like everyone is more together than you are. But what if you're not too much? What if you just live life more intensely than most people, and that's okay? And in fact, it's more than okay. It's a superpower. In just a moment, you're going to learn about a trait that you may have never known about before, a trait that could very well describe you. Our guest for today, Aurora Holtzman, is an expert in twice exceptionality and excitability. She's an educational consultant and coach and founder of the Embracing Intensity community and podcast for gifted, creative, and out-of-the-box thinkers. Welcome, Aurora.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So one of the things I really love about your story is that you say that when you were a kid, you felt like an orange in a box of apples. So what was it like growing up and feeling like you didn't fit in?
Well, it's funny because it was actually something, I think this is what inspired me to become a school psychologist, was that I was having trouble in school. I was also super young for my grades, so I was immature as well. And they had me tested at one point, and the person said, "She's not a smaller apple, she's an orange." And that kind of became my motto for life in general. And so I was fortunate in that my family was really supportive of being unconventional. And so I never felt less than in my own home, which was always a great thing. But in the school setting, I definitely experienced feeling too much, feeling like I was just not, well, especially in elementary school, I was always getting in trouble because I was hyper at the time and I was asking questions all the time, and they were very authoritarian kind of school setting. And so I remember I have friends who we knew through the Unitarian Church that came to the same school as us, and they were all rule followers. And they always, every year, my friends got Citizen of the Month, and at least once a year. And I never did. I remember one year, my fourth grade year, I think, I got it. And I still remember, and I don't visualize very well, so I don't have images in my head, but I still remember the hot pink coat I was wearing, and I was on top of the monkey bars because I just like getting Citizen of the Month was such a big deal. And when I think about back on that time too, I think that fourth grade teacher was the only teacher in elementary school that I got the impression actually liked me. And so I felt like through fifth grade, I never had any teachers that liked me. And when in fifth grade, I took a test for the gifted program, I hadn't passed at that point, and I don't know if it's because of the undiagnosed ADHD or because I didn't read very well because of the Spanish immersion program, so my English reading wasn't great. They tested me and they said I needed to actually get out of that school and into a full-time gifted program because my score was high enough. And so mid-year, fifth grade, they actually moved me to a different school. And then through middle school, most people think of middle school as being this awful, awful time. But for me, actually, middle school was the best time for me because I had a very small class that really met my needs. But then in high school, I got to the point where they were all high achievers and I was an underachiever, and they almost kicked me out of the program. So it was definitely finding that place in school was always the biggest challenge for me.
So when did you finally learn that there was a word for this constellation of traits you had, and it wasn't ADHD, it was something else?
Yeah, and it's definitely common in not just ADHD, but a lot of both gifted and neurodiversity. They're both kind of on that spectrum. And it was actually when my son went to school in kindergarten, and he was having some behavior issues, and he actually eventually did get diagnosed with ADHD, but it wasn't as obvious in the beginning. But he had sensory issues. He was very intense, and from birth, I mean, the day one, he couldn't nurse without popping off to look at every sound from day one. And so he was super intense and super colicky as an infant. And moving into elementary, I was trying to look up behavior problems in gifted kids, and I came upon this article by Jade Rivera. She has a series of blog posts on overexcitability, and I've actually met Jade in person now. She's been on the podcast, and she's amazing. She does stuff on micro schools, and she talked about overexcitability, and it just clicked that. So overexcitability is both being more sensitive than others, but also reacting more intensely. So it's if you think of an excitable nerve, it responds like really quickly. And so they talk about 5 areas of excitability. And I always forget this when I'm talking out loud. So it's intellectual, imaginative, sensory, emotional, and then physical, psychomotor. So the movement, always needing to move. And so when I looked at those things and realized that I related to almost every one of them.
So for those of you watching at the end of the show, we are going to give you a link because Aurora has a free workbook to help you decide whether this is a trait you have and which type it is. So make sure to watch for that. But Aurora, so we've got overexcitability, but there's also another term that you introduced me to that I hadn't heard before that you speak a lot about, and that's twice exceptionality. What is that?
Mm-hmm. So twice exceptionality is being both gifted and having a disability or neurodiversity of some type. So for example, I was identified gifted in 5th grade, but I didn't actually realize that I had ADHD, and I self-diagnosed right after I dropped out of college. And I finally got formally diagnosed just this last year. And because when you have the gifted part in one area and the disability in the other, oftentimes they appear to either cancel each other out, or one of them is more apparent than the other, so the other one doesn't get identified. And so some kids get identified special education, but no one actually realizes that they're gifted. And part of the problem is that you can underscore on tests, but you can't overscore. So for example, you could have a kid who looks like their cognitive ability is average, but maybe they weren't interested in the test, or they had a learning disability that got in the way of part of the test, or there's different factors that can influence it. So you can't always tell based on just the testing. And or on the other hand, you have kids who were identified gifted, and you'll find a ton of this on Twitter. There are so many people who resent being identified gifted because they could never live up to the expectation. And so they always felt bad. And that's where I fell into place. So I got into college, I got into a really good private university, or not university, college, but I dropped out 2 years in because I started having all these health issues. I couldn't keep up, and I couldn't handle it. And so it was that point that I learned about ADHD, and it made sense, and I came up with my own strategies. But what I didn't realize is that those strategies were what contributed to my chronic health issues. So I have fibromyalgia and adrenal fatigue. And I was treating that since my early 20s, and I could never really figure out. I tried Western medicine, I tried alternative therapies, I tried all sorts of things, and some things helped. But since I've been on the medication the past couple months, I realized my headaches have gone. I was getting chronic headaches when we first started working from home because of the stress. And I've had no headaches. My fatigue's been better. And if I had realized early on the impact, I knew they were related, but I didn't really realize that treating the one would help the other.
So one of the things I want to ask you about, because there may be people watching this right now who think, gosh, yeah, people do say I'm too much, but am I really genuinely excitable? You have a blog post on your site that's things that only an excitable person would understand. Could you share some of those points with us?
Oh yeah, let's see if I if I can think of it off the top of my head. But yeah, it was fun because back when I first started, I was focused on women. I've expanded because I had a lot of people asking about resources for men, and so my embracing intensity community is everyone, but my Facebook community is for women, and it's called the League of Excitable Women. And so I asked in there, I gave some examples, and I asked for some examples, and what I found especially funny was the things that people were like, oh yeah, I have that. And so there were things I wouldn't have thought about, like um, picking up accents, the you're picking up somebody else's accent, or you, and uh, there was one, yeah, feeling both too much and not enough at the same time. And let's see, there's a lot. I mean, there's 25 things, but this is where my recall, this is my ADHD. The recall part, I have it in front of me. I can tell you everything.
Well,
and
and
I,
I just want to tell you, for
mhm,
the viewers, we are going to put a link to that post below. So if you just check out that link, you can read them all yourself and see if
yeah.
you identify with them.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I wanted, a lot of times people will look at it, especially from the ADHD perspective, but it is not just people who are ADHD. There's people who have other th- brain differences, learning differences, sensory differences. Highly sensitive people can fall under that. But the key part is that intensity of experience. So we're more sensitive and more reactive to things, and so that can be a good thing, but it can also lead to challenges.
And one of the biggest problems for anybody who's been told they're too much, it's never a compliment. When someone
Mm-hmm.
says you're too much, when someone says, gosh, you really take things so personally, you overreact, they're never giving you a compliment. I had a friend who once told me that we live on an emotional pendulum. And she said, you always want to stay in the middle. You don't want to swing too far one way because you're going to swing too far the other way, and that's not okay. And so I consider myself a creative person. My creativity is very much part of who I am. And my creativity is always activated by the extremes of emotional experience. And I thought,
Mm-hmm.
if I stay in the middle, I'm dead. So,
Mm-hmm.
how have you dealt with the stigma against being too much and that pressure to be bland?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for me, it's all about channeling the energy in the direction that you want it to go. So it's not about being someone else for other people, but it's about being able to channel it for yourself. And so channeling it in the direction. So one of the things in the workbook that I talk about is looking at looking at a trait that you might think is too much, and how does that look when it's out of control? How does it look when you're trying to suppress it? Because when you're trying to suppress it, it's bound to kind of come leaking out, or tamp you down and your energy, affect your energy level. And then how does it look when it's fully realized and channeled in a positive direction? And so that's a big part for me, is figuring out those traits and how you can use them in a positive way.
And you've got a whole community set up to support people with this. You've got a podcast. Tell us about how you're supporting people through this.
Yeah, well, so the podcast I started 4 years ago. I just had 90,000 downloads. I expect I'll probably hit 100,000 by the time, by my fourth anniversary in October. But so I started interviewing women, and then a couple years ago I expanded, like I said, because there wasn't anything out there for men. And I've actually noticed a lot of interactions on Twitter that there's a lot of on all sides. And so the interviews, they're not all twice exceptional, but I started to notice when I looked back on a lot of them that a lot of them were. And I am, and being a school psychologist, it's an interest of mine. And I started realizing the challenges that oftentimes come with that. And so in the community, I have a course that I'm redoing over this year. I started it 5 years ago, but I'm finally kind of getting it to where I want it to be, which is called Ignite Your Power. And we talk about basically self-regulation. So how do you regulate your emotions, your physical, your energy? And so each month I'm redoing the lessons in the community with a group call. And I also have some guest calls coming in. So we're going to do one on play that may be passed by the time this airs. And I really love having those guest speakers come into play because they can talk about the topics that they're really experts in, and we can have conversations with the community. And so that part, the talk often goes on the podcast, but the whole conversation recording goes in the community. So a lot of it can be driven by what other people are wanting to hear at the time. And it's been great to see people from different parts of the world connecting. Like I had someone in the Caribbean and someone in Canada. It was like a single college person in the Caribbean and somebody in Canada who's got a huge family that were connecting so much that one of them made a meme about a quote from the other. And it was just so, just the, seeing people connect all around the world who have very different life experiences that can relate over certain commonalities has been great.
So how do you feel like your life has changed since you have had a word to describe what you're going through?
I think finding connection with the right people has been great. And I mean, I did some of that before. When I first moved up here, it was hard to find connection and people that I could relate to right away. And what I realized is that I'm very fortunate because I had family and I had community growing up that seemed to understand me for the most part. And I realized that's really rare and not everyone has that. So when I came up here and I was missing that, I didn't really have it to start. I knew it was possible. And so I knew I could find that, and I knew that it was there. But a lot of people who've never had that experience, who've never had that connection, they don't necessarily know it's possible. And so they don't really know how to go about it, how to find community. So for me, I found it in the theater community theater when I first started here. And then I found it in the Unitarian Universalist young adult group back when I first was up here, because that's what I grew up in, and that was a source of community for me. So and then online, of course, you find all these groups and connections, and through the entrepreneur community in Portland, oftentimes I would make connections, but it helps kind of figure out who you're connecting with as when you're interacting with people, because I'll notice that, especially, I'm not a normal networker. Like I don't like meet up for coffee and talk about what it is you do. I had like I'll have these in-depth conversations, and like I had one who I talked to for hours. She got called from her school, but we still connect, on a regular basis. And it's that kind of intensity of connection that you really don't always get. I'm not that superficial. I mean, I like it, but I think it's when I'm in a networking situation, I feel like I have to be on all the time. And like you said, that staying in the middle kind of thing for me, I have to worry about, am I talking too much? Am I picking up on their signals? Am I, getting too excited? And so I get anxious in those situations. And so one-on-one, when you've made that connection, when you recognize that intensity in someone else, it's so much easier to just relax into the conversation because they're just as intense as you. And so you're not as worried.
So I absolutely love that, and I agree with you completely. So for those of you watching, if you think that these excitability traits might describe you or might describe someone you love, Aurora has a free workbook called Harnessing the Power of Your Intensity, that describes the 5 different types and can help you identify whether you've got any of them. If you want that workbook, we have a link for you. Just go to yourbrilliance.org/intensity. That's yourbrilliance.org/intensity. Thank you so much, Aurora, for coming on. And I wondered if you had any last message you would like to leave our viewers with.
Well, I think just thinking about harnessing our intensity or managing our intensity is not for other people. It's for yourself so that you can use it and not let it get in the way. You know, I think about I don't know if you're familiar with the hand model of the brain, but that fight, when you get into fight flight mode and your amygdala takes over, this being your frontal lobe. I just think when we let our intensity get out of control, we get into that amygdala point. And so when I talk about harnessing your intensity, it's for yourself. It's not for other people. But I think back on, I was having a conversation with this guy, Jeff Harry, who does play. He does workshops around play, and he was talking about how he finally figured out if he's just him, he'll attract the right people, and he wears a Lego bow tie everywhere, to every conference he goes to, and it brings those people. And so we had this long conversation about, you know, trying to fit in versus just being you and drawing the right people to you. And if you're trying to fit in, I think about Brene Brown and her talking about fitting in versus belonging. If we're trying too hard to tone down our innate self, then we may fit in, but we're not going to truly belong until we can be our full selves.
Thank you so much. And thank you out there for watching. Now, did you have any aha moments or insights while watching this interview? If so, share them with us in the comments. And for more interviews like these, make sure to subscribe to Your Brilliance TV here on YouTube, and then come on over to yourbrilliance.com for more tips and insights on how you can live your most brilliant life. See you next time.